On November 4th, 1964, a physicist named John Stewart Bell published a paper that should have changed everything. It did not. The paper appeared in a journal called Physics Physique, a trilingual publication so obscure that it folded 4 years later after printing only 4 volumes. Bell chose this journal because it did not charge page fees. It actually paid authors. He spent his payment buying reprints to hand out to colleagues who might be interested. Most were not. The paper was titled On the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen Paradox. It was 6 pages long. It contained a mathematical proof that would eventually earn 3 other physicists the Nobel Prize 60 years after Bell died without receiving it himself. In its first 6 years, the paper received fewer than a dozen citations. The physics community largely ignored it. The questions it raised were considered, in the words of one prominent physicist, unprofessional. Here is what the paper proved. The universe cannot be locally realistic, while also allowing experimenters to freely choose what they measure. At least one of those 3 things must be false. Either information travels faster than light, or particles do not have definite properties until measured, or your choice of what to measure was never actually a choice at all. It was fixed, determined, written into the initial conditions of the universe at the moment of the Big Bang. That last option has a name. Physicists call it superdeterminism. And if superdeterminism is true, then every decision you have ever made, including the decision to watch this video, was not a decision. It was an inevitability, not because of fate, not because of God, because of physics. You were never told this. Not in school, not in any popular science article you have read, not in any documentary you have watched. The physics community confirmed it experimentally in 1982. They closed every loophole by 2015. They won the Nobel Prize for it in 2000 and 2002. And somehow, the implications for the question that matters most to you, whether you actually control your own life, remained buried in technical papers that almost nobody reads. Think about the decisions you made today: what to eat, whether to exercise, what to say to someone you care about. You experience those as choices, open possibilities, forks in the road where you picked a direction. But here is the question Bell's paper forces you to confront. Were those forks ever real? Or were you always going to turn left, and the feeling of choosing was just the experience of a predetermined process running its course? This is not philosophy. This is not some abstract debate for academics to argue about over wine. This is experimental physics. Testable, repeatable, confirmed, and the answer it gives is deeply uncomfortable. But Bell's theorem is only the beginning, because even if you reject superdeterminism, even if you accept that quantum mechanics involves genuine randomness, that particles really do exist in superposition until measured, that God does play dice with the universe, even then you do not escape, because randomness is not freedom. Randomness is just a different kind of prison, and the laws that govern that prison are called probability. Those laws are absolute. They have been suppressed, misunderstood, and catastrophically misapplied for centuries. And they have something very specific to say about the choices you think you make. John Stewart Bell was born on July 28, 1928, in Belfast, Northern Ireland. His family was working class in the truest sense. His father, Jackie, sold horses. His mother, Annie, was a dressmaker. Neither of his parents completed high school. None of his 3 older siblings did either. They dropped out around age 14 to work, as was common for families like theirs. Education was a luxury. Survival came first. Bell decided at age 11 that he would become a scientist. This was, by any reasonable measure, an absurd ambition for a boy in his circumstances. But his mother believed in him. When he earned admission to Queen's University, Belfast, she sewed his academic gown herself. She made it from blackout curtains left over from the war. An exceptionally rare occurrence, one biographer wrote, for someone of his background. He earned not one, but 2 bachelor's degrees from Queen's, the first in experimental physics in 1948, the second in mathematical physics in 1949. He completed his doctorate at the University of Birmingham in 1956. He married Mary Ross, a fellow physicist, in 1954. They would collaborate for the rest of his life. In 1960, Bell joined CERN in Geneva. His official work was particle physics and accelerator design. But quantum foundations, the deep questions about what quantum mechanics actually means, that was his hobby. He listed his specialty in one official CERN document as quantum engineering. It was a joke. Nobody at CERN took quantum foundations seriously. The questions had been settled in the 1920s, or so everyone believed. Bohr and Heisenberg had won. Copenhagen was the answer. Shut up and calculate. Bell did not shut up. During a sabbatical in 1963 and 64, visiting Stanford, the University of Wisconsin, and Brandeis, he finally had time to work on what he actually cared about. He wrote 2 papers that year, one on hidden variables, one on Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen. The second one contained the theorem. The theorem emerged from a question Einstein had asked 3 decades earlier. Einstein hated quantum mechanics, not the math. The math worked beautifully. He hated what the math seemed to say about reality. Quantum mechanics claimed that particles did not have definite properties until measured. That measuring one entangled particle instantly affected its partner, no matter how far apart they were. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance, and he refused to believe it. In 1935, Einstein and 2 colleagues, Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen, published a paper arguing that quantum mechanics must be incomplete. There must be hidden variables, information we do not yet have access to, that determine the outcomes in advance. The particles know what they are going to do before we measure them. The apparent randomness is just our ignorance, not a feature of reality itself. This would save locality, no faster than light influences, no spooky action. Bell's theorem proved Einstein wrong. Or rather, it proved that Einstein's hope was impossible. Bell showed mathematically that no theory involving local hidden variables can reproduce all the predictions of quantum mechanics. If hidden variables exist, they must be non-local. Information must travel faster than light, or there are no hidden variables at all, and particles genuinely do not have definite properties until observed. Or, and this is the escape hatch that haunts everything, the experimenter's choices of what to measure are not actually free. They are correlated with the hidden variables in a way that makes the whole question meaningless. Bell derived an inequality, a mathematical limit on how correlated measurement outcomes can be in any local hidden variable theory. Quantum mechanics predicts violations of this limit. If you run the right experiment and find violations, you have proven that local hidden variables are impossible. Reality is not what Einstein hoped. Bell himself put it simply: if a hidden variable theory is local, it will not agree with quantum mechanics, and if it agrees with quantum mechanics, it will not be local. The paper sat mostly unread for years. The journal folded. Bell went back to his accelerator work. But the theorem was a time bomb. Sooner or later, someone would have to test it. The first serious test came in 1972. Stuart Friedman and John Clauser, working in a sub-basement at UC Berkeley, measured polarization correlations in photons emitted from calcium atoms. They found violations of Bell's inequality. Quantum mechanics was right. Local hidden variables were ruled out. You might think this would have been major news. It was not. Most of the physics faculty at Berkeley said the experiment was pointless. You got exactly what quantum mechanics predicted, they said. What was the point? Clauser later told the American Institute of Physics that he had hoped to overthrow quantum mechanics. He failed. But the failure itself was historic. There was a problem with the experiment, though. The measurement settings were fixed in advance. In principle, some signal could have traveled between the two detectors, coordinating the results. The locality loophole remained open. In 1982, Alain Aspect closed it, working at the Institut Optique in Orsay, France. Aspect used acousto-optical switches that changed the measurement settings every 10 nanoseconds. The photons were in flight for 20 nanoseconds, traveling 6 meters. The settings changed while the photons were already on their way. No signal traveling at the speed of light could have carried information from one detector to the other in time to affect the result. When Aspect first proposed this experiment, he visited Bell to explain his plan. Bell's first words were not encouragement. They were a question. Do you have a permanent position? Aspect said yes, he had tenure. Bell nodded. Good. Then you should do it. The implication was clear. This experiment would be seen as a waste of time, professionally dangerous for anyone without job security. Aspect ran the experiment. He found violations. Bell's inequality was broken by nature itself. Local hidden variables were impossible. But there was still another loophole. The detectors did not catch every photon. Perhaps the ones that were detected were a biased sample. Perhaps the photons that escaped detection would have restored the inequality if they had been measured. It took 33 more years to close that loophole. In 2015, Ronald Hansen's team at Delft University of Technology achieved the first fully loophole-free Bell test. They used 2 diamonds with nitrogen vacancy centers, separated by 1.28 kilometers. They entangled them using photons and measured the results with detectors efficient enough to catch nearly everything. The result was S equals 2.42, plus or minus 0.20. The classical limit is S less than or equal to 2. They broke it, with both loopholes closed, simultaneously. Similar results followed from NIST, in Boulder, a group in Vienna, a team in Munich. The Munich experiment rejected local realism at a p-value of 1.02 times 10 to the negative 16th power. That is a 1 in 10 quadrillion chance that the result was a statistical fluke. It was not a fluke. But the most dramatic test came in 2017, the Cosmic Bell Test. A team at the Tidy Observatory in the Canary Islands used photons from quasars ancient light sources billions of light years away. The light from one quasar had been traveling for 8 billion years. The light from the other had been traveling for 12 billion years. The researchers used the wavelengths of these photons to determine the measurement settings. If superdeterminism were true, if the measurement choices were somehow correlated with hidden variables that determined the outcomes, that correlation would have to have been established billions of years ago, before our solar system existed. The result was a violation of Bell's inequality by 9.3 standard deviations, a p-value of less than 7.4 times 10 to the negative 21st power. The superdeterminism conspiracy, if it exists, must have been set in motion at least 7.8 billion years ago. It must encompass 96% of the space-time volume of the experiment's past light cone. 1 year later, an even stranger experiment, the Big Bell test. On November 30th, 2016, over 100,000 human volunteers around the world participated in an online video game. Their random button presses determined the measurement settings for 12 different Bell test experiments running simultaneously in laboratories across the globe. The human choices replaced the random number generators. If free will exists, if human decisions are not predetermined, then these settings should be truly random, truly independent of any hidden variables. The results, published in 2018, showed violations of Bell's inequality in every single laboratory. Human free will, whatever it is, did not save local realism. In 2000, the Nobel Prize in Physics went to Alain, John Clauser, and Anton Zeilinger. The citation read, "For experiments with entangled photons, establishing the violation of Bell inequalities and pioneering quantum information science." At the Nobel banquet, Aspect said something that should have made headlines. That recognition should go first to the late John Stewart Bell, without whom we would not be here today. Bell died on October 1st, 1990, in Geneva. He was 62. A cerebral hemorrhage. He was reportedly nominated for the Nobel Prize that same year. Without his knowledge, the committee does not give the prize posthumously. He missed it by months. So the experiments confirm it. The universe is not locally realistic. You must give up locality, or realism, or measurement independence. Most physicists give up local realism. They accept that particles do not have definite properties until measured, or that measurement creates non-local correlations across arbitrary distances, or both. These options are strange, but they preserve the assumption that experimenters can freely choose what to measure. But there is one escape hatch that preserves local realism: superdeterminism, the assumption that our choices are not free, that the settings we pick for our experiments are correlated with the hidden variables we are trying to detect, that the universe is a single deterministic block, with no room for genuine choice anywhere. Gerard Hooft, who won the Nobel Prize in 1990 for his work on electroweak interactions, is the most prominent champion of superdeterminism. He has developed what he calls the cellular automaton interpretation of quantum mechanics, published as a book in 2016. His argument is straightforward. If a theory is deterministic all the way, it implies that not only all observed phenomena, but also the observers themselves are controlled by deterministic laws. They certainly have no free will. Their actions all have roots in the past, even the distant past. Hooft once discussed this with Bell himself in the early 1980s. I raised the question, Toot Hooft recalled. Suppose that also Alice's and Bob's decisions have to be seen as not coming out of free will, but being determined by everything in the theory. John said, well, you know that I have to exclude. If it is possible, then what I said does not apply. Bell knew. He knew that superdeterminism was the exit. He excluded it by assumption. But you cannot exclude something by assumption forever. Eventually, you have to justify the assumption. Sabine Hossenfelder, a theoretical physicist at the Frankfurt Institute for Advanced Studies, has argued that superdeterminism has been unfairly dismissed. In a 2020 paper in Frontiers in Physics, co-authored with Tim Palmer, she called it the forgotten solution. The physics community has treated it as a conspiracy theory, she argues, without properly considering its merits. She has stated publicly that free will does not exist from a physics perspective. But the critics of superdeterminism are numerous and vocal. Anton Zeilinger, one of the 2022 Nobel laureates, has warned that accepting superdeterminism would undermine all of science. We always implicitly assume the freedom of the experimentalist, he said. If this were not true, then nature could determine what our questions are, and that could guide our questions in such a way that we arrive at a crackpot theory. Philosopher Tim Maudlin has made what he calls the tobacco lobbyist argument. If you accept superdeterminism, a tobacco company could argue that the rats in a smoking study were predetermined to be cancer-prone. The hidden variables made them sick, not the cigarettes. Every experiment becomes uninterpretable. Every correlation becomes meaningless. Howard Wiseman and Eric Cavalcanti, in a paper analyzing superdeterministic models, concluded that any such theory would be about as plausible and appealing as belief in ubiquitous alien mind control. John Conway, the mathematician famous for the game of life, took a different approach entirely. In 2006, he and Simon Cochin published the free will theorem in the journal Foundations of Physics. Their argument was elegant. If experimenters have free will, meaning their choices are not functions of the past, then particles must also have free will. Their measurement outcomes cannot be determined by anything in the past either. Conway's personal conclusion was striking. I believe that the universe is teeming with free will, but that belief required accepting something even stranger than superdeterminism. It required accepting that electrons and photons, in some sense, choose what to do. So superdeterminism is not a real escape. It saves local realism at the cost of destroying the entire scientific enterprise. Most physicists reject it for exactly this reason. They accept non-locality, or they accept that particles lack definite properties, or they accept some combination. These are strange conclusions, but they are not fatal to science. Here is the part that should disturb you. Even if you reject superdeterminism, even if you accept standard quantum mechanics with all its weirdness, quantum randomness, superposition, wave function collapse, even then, you do not get your free will back. Because randomness is not freedom. Carlo Rovelli, one of the founders of loop quantum gravity, put it this way in a 2013 Edge essay. The equations of quantum mechanics do not determine what will happen, but determine strictly the probability of what will happen. In other words, they certify that the violation of determinism is strictly random. This goes in exactly the opposite direction from human freedom to choose. If human freedom was reducible to quantum indeterminism, then we should conclude that human choices are strictly regulated by chance, which is the opposite of freedom. Think about what that means. The standard escape from determinism is randomness, but randomness does not help you. If your decision to raise your hand was determined by the laws of physics, you did not freely choose it. If your decision to raise your hand was random, like radioactive decay, you also did not freely choose it. The coin flip chose, not you. Sam Harris crystallized the dilemma. Either our wills are determined by prior causes and we are not responsible for them, or they are the product of chance and we are not responsible for them. Determinism or randomness. Neither gives you what you want. John Searle, the philosopher of mind, made the same point. Indeterminism at the level of particles is really no support at all to any doctrine of the freedom of the will. And there is a deeper problem still. Even if individual quantum events are random, aggregate behavior is not. The law of large numbers guarantees this. Flip a coin once, and you cannot predict the outcome. Flip it 1 billion times, and you know almost exactly how many heads you will get. Quantum mechanics introduces randomness at the micro level, but at the macro level, at the level of human beings and human behavior, that randomness averages out into something terrifyingly predictable. This is where probability theory enters the story. And probability theory has its own history of suppression, misunderstanding, and catastrophic failure. A history that leads somewhere very dark. In 1654, a French gambler approached the mathematician Blaise Pascal with a problem. The gambler's name was Antoine Gombeau, though he called himself the Chevalier de Mere. He was not actually a knight. Mere was a character from his own books. The problem was about dice. If a game of chance is interrupted before either player has won, how should the pot be divided fairly? Mathematicians had struggled with this question since Luca Pacioli first posed it in 1494. 160 years. No solution. Pascal wrote to Pierre de Fermat, and between July and October of that year, they exchanged approximately 7 letters. The introductory letter is lost. The surviving correspondence invented probability theory. Pascal developed a method of recursive backward induction using expected values. Fermat enumerated all possible outcomes exhaustively. They arrived at the same answer by different paths, and in the process, they created a framework for reasoning about uncertainty that would eventually touch every aspect of human life. Pascal's letter of July 29th, 1654, survives. "Impatience has seized me as well as it has you," he wrote. "I admire it more than I can tell you." In his September 25th letter, Pascal included a dig at the gambler who started it all. He has a very good mind, but he is not a geometer. This is, as you know, a great defect. Pascal was a child prodigy who invented a mechanical calculator before age 19. But a few weeks after his last letter to Fermat, his carriage nearly ran off a bridge at Neuilly. The horses plunged over the edge. The traces broke. The carriage teetered but did not fall. Pascal survived, but the experience triggered a religious conversion so intense that he sewed a parchment describing it into the lining of his coat. He wore it for the rest of his life. He abandoned mathematics. He abandoned games of chance. He spent his remaining years on theology. He died in 1662 at 39. Fermat, by contrast, was a lawyer in Toulouse who practiced mathematics as an amateur. He is most famous for scribbling a theorem in the margin of a book with the note that he had discovered a truly marvelous proof that this margin is too small to contain. That proof took 358 years to find. Andrew Wiles finally completed it in 1994. Fermat died in 1665, never knowing what his marginal note would cost future mathematicians. A century after Pascal and Fermat, a Presbyterian minister named Thomas Bayes solved the inverse problem. Pascal and Fermat had asked, given a probability, what outcomes should we expect? Bayes asked, given outcomes, what probability should we infer? He imagined a ball thrown randomly onto a square table, with subsequent balls observed landing left or right of the first. From the proportion of lefts and rights, one could infer where the first ball likely landed. This was inference under uncertainty, learning from evidence, updating beliefs as data accumulates. Bayes was born around 1701 to Joshua Bayes, one of the first 6 nonconformist ministers ordained in England. As a dissenter's son, Thomas was barred from attending Oxford or Cambridge. He enrolled at the University of Edinburgh in 1719, studying logic and theology. Around 1734, he became minister of the Presbyterian Chapel at Mount Sion in Tunbridge Wells, a tourist spa town 35 miles southeast of London. He was elected Fellow of the Royal Society in 1742, unusual for a rural minister. He never married. He had no children. Bayes never published his most important result. He died in April 1761. His family gave his papers to a friend, Richard Price, a Welsh minister and mathematician. Price spent approximately 2 years editing the manuscript. Some scholars argue Price wrote about half of the published paper and was the first person to publicly apply the theory. Perhaps we should call it the Bayes-Price rule. Price presented the paper to the Royal Society on December 23, 1763, and it was published the following year. The theorem that bears Bayes' name is arguably the most important result in the history of reasoning about uncertainty, and Bayes himself never saw it in print. Price's motivation for publishing was theological. He wanted to demonstrate that there are, in the constitution of things, fixed laws according to which things happen. He was using probability to argue for God's existence through design. The framework would eventually be used for everything from cracking Nazi codes to landing spacecraft on Mars. Price could not have imagined any of it. Pierre-Simon Laplace, the French mathematician sometimes called the French Newton, independently developed Bayesian inference and extended it far beyond what Bayes had imagined. His Théorie analytique des probabilités appeared in 1812. 2 years later, he published a philosophical companion essay containing a famous thought experiment. We may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its past and the cause of its future, Laplace wrote. An intellect which, at a certain moment, would know all forces that set nature in motion and all positions of all items of which nature is composed, if this intellect were also vast enough to submit these data to analysis, it would embrace in a single formula the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the tiniest atom. For such an intellect, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, as the past, would be present to its eyes. This hypothetical intellect became known as Laplace's demon, though Laplace never used that word. He wrote unintelligence. An intellect, for Laplace, chance was but an expression of man's ignorance. Probability was not a feature of reality. It was a measure of what we do not know. There is a famous anecdote about Laplace and Napoleon. After receiving a copy of Mécanique Céleste, Napoleon asked why God was not mentioned anywhere in the work. Laplace allegedly replied, "I had no need of that hypothesis. The story may be embellished." The only contemporary account from astronomer William Herschel's diary entry of August 8, 1802, describes the discussion, but does not include the pithy wording. Whether Laplace said those exact words or not, the sentiment was accurate. His system had no gaps that required divine intervention to fill. Laplace also wrote something that should have been a warning. It is remarkable that a science which began with the consideration of games of chance should have become the most important object of human knowledge. You might think Bayesian reasoning, this powerful framework for learning from evidence, would have spread rapidly through science. It did not. For most of the 20th century, it was actively suppressed. Ronald Fisher, the father of modern statistics, explicitly rejected Bayesian methods. In his foundational 1922 paper, he wrote that the theory of inverse probability is founded upon an error and must be wholly rejected. Fisher was not a minor figure. He essentially created the modern framework of statistical significance, p-values, and hypothesis testing that dominates science to this day. When he declared Bayesian methods invalid, people listened. Jerzy Neyman, another giant of statistics, was a pure frequentist. Egon Pearson, son of Carl Pearson, believed Bayesian statistics had been forever discredited by Fisher. The three men did not agree on much. Fisher and Neyman were bitter rivals. Neyman published a paper in 1961 titled "A Silver Jubilee of My Dispute with Fisher." 25 years of fighting, but they were united in opposing Bayes. The hostility was professional and personal. Leonard Jimmy Savage, one of the few prominent defenders of Bayesian statistics in mid-century America, had a colleague approach his 9-year-old son at a garden party in Stanford in the mid-1960s to tell the child that his father was a deeply deluded man. Sharon Birch McGrain, who documented this history in her book, The Theory That Would Not Die, notes that the fact that a child would be considered a legitimate target in this war speaks to the intensity of the battle. Dennis Lindley in the UK and Savage in the US were virtually the only prominent academic Bayesians in the 1970s. They were regarded as fringe figures, outcasts, working on a theory that the mainstream had declared dead. Meanwhile, the most powerful validation of Bayesian methods was classified. At Bletchley Park during World War II, Alan Turing developed a system called Banburismus to crack the German Enigma cipher I.J. Good, Turing's assistant and later a prominent statistician himself, revealed decades later what it was. All our data analysis was completely Bayesian, and that was a direct inheritance from Alan Turing. Turing, almost as a sideline during his cryptoanalytic work, reinvented Bayesian statistics for himself. He introduced a unit of evidence weight called the BAN, a term still used in information theory, the method that helped win the war, the framework that cracked the code the Germans believed uncrackable. It was Bayesian, and it was classified until the 1970s. The full story was not declassified until the 1990s. For decades, The statistical community fought over the validity of an approach that had already proven itself in the highest possible stakes, and nobody could tell them. You have probably heard of Bayesian statistics as one approach among many, an alternative to frequentist methods, a philosophical preference some researchers have. That framing is wrong. Bayesian reasoning is how probability actually works. It was not an alternative that lost a fair fight. It was suppressed by professional politics, by intellectual tribalism, by the sheer force of Ronald Fisher's personality and influence. The framework that could have saved lives was buried, and the consequences of that burial are measured in human bodies. Sally Clark was a solicitor in England. In December 1996, her first son, Christopher, died at 11 weeks old. In January 1998, her second son, Harry, died at 8 weeks old. She was charged with murder. At her trial in November 1990, an expert witness named Roy Meadow, a professor of pediatrics at Leeds, cited a study from the Confidential Inquiry into Stillbirths and Deaths in Infancy. The study showed that the risk of sudden infant death syndrome in a low-risk household was about 1 in 8,543. Meadow squared this number to get the probability of 2 SIDS deaths in the same family, 1 in 73 million. He told the jury this was like backing an 80-1 outsider in the Grand National 4 years running and winning each time. He had an informal principle he liked to cite. 1 sudden infant death is a tragedy. 2 is suspicious. 3 is murder. Sally Clark was convicted. She went to prison. The statistical reasoning was catastrophically wrong in at least 3 ways. First, the multiplication was invalid. SIDS deaths cluster in families due to shared genetic and environmental factors. The probability of a second SIDS death given a first is not 1 in 8,500. Studies suggest it is closer to 1 in 60 or 1 in 100. The events are not independent. You cannot simply multiply. Second, even if the 1 in 73 million figure were correct, it does not tell you the probability that Sally Clark is guilty. This is the prosecutor's fallacy. You have to compare the probability of double SIDS to the probability of double infanticide. Professor Ray Hill of Salford University performed the proper Bayesian analysis. He calculated that the odds actually favored SIDS over murder by a ratio of 4.5 to 1, possibly as high as 9 to 1. The probability that the infants died of SIDS rather than murder was approximately 60%, more likely than not that she was innocent. Third, crucial evidence was suppressed. The pathologist Alan Williams had withheld bacteriology results showing Staphylococcus aureus, a potentially deadly bacterium, in multiple sites of baby Harry's body, including cerebrospinal fluid. There was microbiological evidence of natural causes. The jury never saw it. The Royal Statistical Society took the extraordinary step of issuing a public statement in October 2001, expressing concern at the misuse of statistics in the courts. Sally Clark's conviction was overturned on second appeal in January 2003. She had spent more than 3 years in prison for crimes she did not commit. Roy Meadow was found guilty of serious professional misconduct by the General Medical Council in July 2005. The Attorney General Lord Goldsmith ordered a review of hundreds of similar cases. 2 other women, Donna Anthony and Angela Cannings, had their convictions overturned. Sally Clark never recovered. She developed serious psychiatric problems and alcohol dependence. She died on March 15, 2007, of acute alcohol poisoning. She was 42 years old. Her life destroyed by statistical illiteracy, dressed up as expert testimony. In the Netherlands, a similar catastrophe unfolded. Lucia de Berg was a pediatric nurse convicted in 2003 of murdering 4 patients. Part of the evidence against her was statistical. A statistician named Henk Elfers calculated that the probability of all the suspicious incidents occurring during her shifts was 1 in 342 million. Richard Gill, a mathematician at the University of Leiden, examined the calculation. He found errors everywhere. Elfers had selected which incidents to include in a way that biased the result. He had made computational mistakes. He had used inappropriate statistical methods. The properly corrected probability was approximately 1 in 25. Unusual, certainly, but not remotely beyond the bounds of chance. Lucia de Berg was acquitted of all charges on April 14, 2010, after spending 6.5 years in prison. Gill's verdict on her case was blunt. Statistics drove the case from start to end. Lucia's conviction was almost entirely based on wrong statistical data, wrongly analyzed and wrongly interpreted. These are not isolated failures. They are symptoms of systematic probability illiteracy that pervades medicine, law, and finance. Gerd Gigerenzer, a psychologist who has spent decades studying how experts understand statistics, gave physicians the following scenario. A disease has a 1% prevalence in the screened population. The test has an 80% sensitivity, meaning it correctly identifies 80% of people who have the disease. The false positive rate is 9.6%. A patient tests positive. What is the probability they actually have the disease? Most physicians estimated 70 to 80%. Some said 90%. They were catastrophically wrong. The correct answer is approximately 8%. Here is the math. Out of 10,000 women screened, 100 have the disease. Of those 100, 80 test positive. True positives. Of the 9,900 who do not have the disease, 950 test positive. False positives, total positives, 1,030. Actual disease cases among positives, 80. 80 divided by 1,030 equals approximately 7.8%. Think about that. A woman receives a positive mammogram. Her doctor tells her, with confidence, based on misunderstood statistics, that she probably has cancer. The actual probability is less than 1 in 10. The doctor's innumeracy has caused unnecessary terror, unnecessary biopsies, unnecessary treatment, unnecessary suffering. Gigerenzer found that after training with natural frequencies, the format I just used, 87% of gynecologists got the right answer. But without that training, most failed completely. He tested HIV counselors at 20 German public health centers and found they could not correctly explain to clients what a positive test result actually meant. A 1998 study in the New England Journal of Medicine followed 2,400 women over 10 years of mammography screening. The cumulative risk of at least one false positive was 49.1%, essentially a coin flip. Half of all women screened for a decade will experience the fear of a positive result that turns out to be wrong. And their doctors often cannot explain to them what the numbers actually mean. Gigerenzer called this collective statistical illiteracy a largely unknown problem in healthcare. He documented how it causes undue fear in the public and leads to both overdiagnosis and underdiagnosis. Women told they have an 80% chance of cancer when the real number is 8% make different decisions about their bodies and their lives. On April 20th, 2015, the Department of Justice and the FBI jointly announced that FBI hair analysis examiners had overstated forensic matches in ways that favored prosecutors in more than 95% of 268 trials reviewed. 26 of 28 analysts provided testimony containing erroneous statements. The cases included 32 defendants sentenced to death. 14 had already been executed or died in prison. The FBI had trained several hundred state and local examiners using the same flawed methodology. The contamination spread through the entire criminal justice system. Lucas Anderson was a 26-year-old homeless man in San Jose. In December 2012, he was charged with capital murder after his DNA was found under a murder victim's fingernails. Anderson had an airtight alibi. He was unconscious in a hospital the night of the murder, severely intoxicated. He could not possibly have committed the crime. Investigation revealed what had happened. The same paramedics who transported Anderson to the hospital earlier that day later responded to the murder scene. His DNA had transferred to their equipment, probably a pulse oximeter placed on his finger, and then to the victim's body, a phantom DNA trail that nearly sent an innocent man to death row. Anderson spent 5 months in jail. He began to doubt his own innocence. He told his public defender the words that should haunt everyone who trusts forensic evidence. Maybe I did do it. These failures are not random. They are predictable. Human probability intuitions are broken in systematic, documented ways. In 1983, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman published a study demonstrating what they called the conjunction fallacy. They gave subjects this description. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Then they asked, which was more probable? Option A, Linda is a bank teller. Option B, Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. 85% of Stanford Business School graduate students in decision science chose option B. This is logically impossible. A conjunction can never be more probable than either of its parts. The set of feminist bank tellers is contained within the set of bank tellers. Every feminist bank teller is also a bank teller. Therefore, being a bank teller and a feminist activist is necessarily less likely than just being a bank teller. These were not random undergraduates. These were graduate students trained in decision science at one of the top business schools in the world. And they got it wrong by a margin of 85%. Stephen Jay Gould, the evolutionary biologist, admitted his own vulnerability to the illusion. A little homunculus in my head continues to jump up and down, shouting at me, but she cannot just be a bank teller. Read the description. Your probability intuitions are not trustworthy, not mine, not yours, not the experts. The machinery we use to assess likelihood is fundamentally miscalibrated, and this brings us to the deepest and most disturbing implication of all. In 1835, a Belgian mathematician named Adolphe Quetelet published a book called Sur l'homme, on man. Quetelet had spent his career applying statistical methods from astronomy to social phenomena. He had access to crime records, marriage records, birth and death records from across Europe, and he discovered something that should have been impossible. Crime rates were stable, year after year, almost exactly the same number of murders, thefts, and assaults. Marriage rates were stable. Even the rate of letters posted with incorrect addresses was stable. Individual humans appeared to be making free choices, getting married or not, committing crimes or not, addressing envelopes correctly or not. But in aggregate, their behavior followed statistical laws with eerie precision. Quetelet called his discovery l'homme moyen, the average man. He argued that individuals had only limited free will. Their actions were dictated by social and institutional contexts. The aggregate was predictable, even when the individual was not. 62 years later, Emil Durkheim pushed this insight into the darkest possible territory. In 1897, he published Suicide, a landmark study that founded modern sociology. His central finding was disturbing. Despite vast differences in individual circumstances, the overall number of suicides in a given society remained remarkably stable from year to year. Different countries had different rates, but each country's rate was consistent over time. Protestant countries had higher rates than Catholic ones. Unmarried people had higher rates than married ones. Rates rose during economic recessions. They fell during wartime. Durkheim's conclusion has haunted sociology ever since. Each society is predisposed to contribute a definite quota of voluntary deaths. Think about what that means. Suicide is the most individual of acts, the ultimate assertion of personal choice. However tragic, the final decision a person can make, and yet the number of people who will make that choice this year in any given country can be predicted with disturbing accuracy. Not which individuals, but how many. Society will fill its quota. It always does. This is the same mathematics that governs radioactive decay. You cannot predict which atom will decay in the next second, but you can predict almost exactly how many atoms out of 1 trillion will decay. The individual is random. The aggregate is law. Insurance companies have known this for over 3 centuries. In 1693, Edmund Halley, the astronomer who calculated the orbit of the comet that bears his name, published the first empirical life table. He analyzed birth and death records from the city of Breslau and calculated fair prices for life annuities. Actuarial science was born, and it works. Insurance companies profit reliably, year after year, because human mortality follows statistical distributions with remarkable precision. The same mathematics that lets insurers calculate your premium lets social scientists predict how many marriages will happen this year, how many divorces, how many crimes, how many bankruptcies, how many traffic accidents. Not which ones, but how many. The individual choices feel free. The totals are predetermined. Your individual choices cannot be predicted, but your aggregate behavior, the behavior of you and everyone statistically like you, follows probability distributions that are known, that can be modeled, that can be exploited. The financial industry provides a brutal illustration. The S&P Global SPIVA scorecard tracks how actively managed funds perform against their benchmark indices. Over the 20 years ending in 2024, 94% of large-cap active fund managers underperformed the S&P 500, they would have made their clients more money by doing nothing, by simply buying the index and sitting on their hands. Over 10 years, roughly 90% of active managers globally underperformed their index. Of the funds that were in the top quartile as of December 2200, not a single one remained in the top quartile over the next 4 years. Past performance does not predict future results. The phrase appears on every fund prospectus. It is true, and it is ignored. Nearly 64% of domestic stock funds were shuttered or merged over 20 years. Survivorship bias flatters the survivor's apparent performance. The dead funds disappear from the statistics. Only the lucky remain. The implication is stark. The vast majority of financial professionals, people who spend their entire careers analyzing markets, who are paid millions of dollars for their expertise, who appear on television explaining why stocks went up or down, cannot beat a strategy of simply buying the index and doing nothing. Their skill is statistically indistinguishable from chance. Long-term capital management was founded in 1994 by John Merriweather, a legendary bond trader from Salomon Brothers, along with Nobel laureates Myron Scholes and Robert Merton. Scholes and Merton had won the 1997 Nobel Prize in economics for the Black-Scholes options pricing model. The fund had the best minds in finance. It had mathematical tools that had earned their creators the highest honor in the field. The fund returned 20% in its first year, then 42.8%, then 40.8%, then 27%. Their models said they could not lose more than $35 million in a single day. The math was precise. The confidence was absolute. When Russia defaulted on its debt on August 17, 1998, LTCM began losing 300 to 500 million daily, not 35 million, 300 to 500 million every day. The models had failed. Total losses reached approximately $4.6 billion. The Federal Reserve organized a $3.6 billion bailout from 14 major banks to prevent systemic collapse of the financial system. On October 19, 1987, Black Monday, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 22.6% in a single day. Approximately $500 billion in value evaporated. Under normal distribution assumptions, the kind of bell curve models that dominated finance, this was a 22 to 25 standard deviation event. The probability of such an event, if markets behaved according to Gaussian models, is approximately 10 to the negative 98th power. That number is so small, it has no meaning. There are approximately 10 to the 80th atoms in the observable universe. A 10 to the negative 98 probability event should happen less than once in a trillion universes. And yet it happened. In our universe, in our lifetime, on a Monday in October. The models were wrong. Markets do not follow normal distributions. Extreme events are far more common than the bell curve predicts. Benoit Mandelbrot, the mathematician who discovered fractals, had been arguing this since the 1960s. His 1963 paper on cotton prices showed that market returns have fat tails. Extreme moves happen far more often than Gaussian statistics allow. He was ignored. The elegant mathematics of normal distributions was too convenient to abandon. In 2000, David X. Lee published a paper in the Journal of Fixed Income introducing the Gaussian copula as a tool for pricing collateralized debt obligations. The model allowed banks to estimate the correlation of default risks across different mortgages and other debts. It became the industry standard almost overnight. The model had a fatal flaw. It assumed zero-tail dependence. It could not account for situations where many assets default simultaneously. It could not model cascading failures. It could not see the cliff edge that the entire financial system was approaching. The Gaussian copula allowed trillions of dollars in CDOs to be rated AAA, safe as government bonds. When the housing market began to collapse, defaults correlated far more than the model predicted. What was supposed to be impossible happened. The result was the 2008 financial crisis, the worst economic catastrophe since the Great Depression. Nassim Taleb, the trader and philosopher who had been warning about fat tails and black swans for years, offered a simple verdict. People got very excited about the Gaussian copula because of its mathematical elegance, but the thing never worked. The pattern repeats across every domain where humans try to predict the future. Experts fail, models fail, intuitions fail, but the aggregate statistics remain eerily stable. Philip Tetlock, a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania, spent 20 years tracking predictions made by political experts. He collected approximately 28,000 predictions from nearly 300 experts about the future of countries, economies, and political systems. The results, published in 2005, were devastating. The average expert did only slightly better than chance. Worse, the most famous experts, the ones who appeared on television and wrote newspaper columns, performed worse than the less famous ones. Confidence and accuracy were negatively correlated. Tetlock called it the dart-throwing chimpanzee problem. A chimp randomly throwing darts at a board of possible outcomes would have done almost as well as the highly paid professionals whose job was to understand the world. And yet, we keep asking experts to predict. We keep trusting their confident pronouncements. We keep being surprised when the world does not behave as they said it would. The neuroscience adds another layer to this picture. Benjamin Libert's experiments in the early 1980s found that brain activity associated with voluntary movement, the so-called readiness potential, appeared approximately 335 milliseconds before subjects reported being consciously aware of their intention to move. The brain had already decided before the person knew they were deciding. Later experiments extended this finding. In 2008, a team led by John Dylan Haynes used functional MRI to predict left or right button presses up to 7 to 10 seconds before subjects reported being aware of their choice. The prediction accuracy was only about 60%, barely above chance, but it was there. The brain showed signs of the upcoming decision before consciousness caught up. These findings have been extensively debated and reinterpreted. Aaron Scherger and colleagues argued in 2012 that the readiness potential might reflect random neural noise crossing a threshold rather than unconscious decision-making. The interpretation remains contested, but the unsettling possibility remains. What if consciousness is not the author of our decisions, but merely the narrator? What if the story we tell ourselves about choosing is exactly that? A story constructed after the fact to explain actions already set in motion. Libet himself offered a consolation. Even if the brain initiates actions before we are aware of intending them, we might still have the ability to veto those actions. Free won't instead of free will. A last-ditch brake pedal rather than a steering wheel. But this consolation has its own problems. If the veto itself is just another brain process, initiated unconsciously before we become aware of vetoing, then we have only pushed the problem back one step. The regress continues. Robert Sapolsky, the neuroendocrinologist at Stanford, published Determined in 2023, a 700-page argument that free will is an illusion. Every behavior, he argues, emerges from genetics, epigenetics, prenatal environment, childhood experiences, hormones, neural circuitry, cultural context, evolutionary pressures, and sheer chance. At no point in this causal chain is there a gap where an uncaused cause, a free choice, could intervene. His criterion is simple. Show me that the thing a neuron just did was unaffected by preceding factors. Show me the gap. Nobody has. The compatibilists offer a different response. Daniel Dennett, who died in 2024 after decades of defending free will as a philosopher, argued that freedom worth wanting is not freedom from causation, but freedom from coercion. You are free when your actions flow from your own desires, beliefs, and character, even if those desires, beliefs, and character were themselves caused by prior events. The question is not whether your choices are caused, but whether they are yours. Roughly 59% of professional philosophers accept or lean toward compatibilism, according to the 22 Phil Papers survey. They argue that the free will most people care about, the ability to act according to their own reasons without external compulsion, is compatible with a deterministic universe. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps the freedom that matters is not metaphysical, but practical. Perhaps it is enough that you experience deliberation, that your choices reflect your values, that you can learn from mistakes and change your behavior. Perhaps the question of ultimate origination is the wrong question, but there is something that nags, something that will not quiet down. If your values themselves were determined by factors outside your control, if you did not choose to be the kind of person who values what you value, then in what sense are those choices really yours? You are the channel through which causation flows. You are the process by which inputs become outputs. But are you the author? The Buddhist traditions have grappled with this for millennia. The doctrine of anatta, no self, suggests that the unified author we imagine ourselves to be is itself an illusion. There is no homunculus inside making decisions. There is only the flow of mental events, each one arising from conditions and giving rise to the next. The sense of a decider separate from the decision is itself just another mental event. Western philosophy arrived at similar questions through different routes. David Hume argued in the 18th century that the self is nothing but a bundle of perceptions, with no underlying substance tying them together. The unified author is a story we tell, not a thing we find. And now physics, with Bell's theorem and its experimental confirmation, has added its own constraints. The universe is not locally realistic. Something has to give. Either information travels faster than light, or particles have no definite properties until measured. All your choices are not independent of the hidden variables you are measuring. None of these options leave the classical picture of free will intact. So where does this leave you? Bell's theorem proves that the universe cannot be locally realistic while preserving measurement independence. The experiments confirmed it. every loophole closed. Nobel Prizes awarded. The only escape is superdeterminism, which destroys science itself. And even if you reject superdeterminism, even if you accept quantum randomness, randomness is not freedom. Randomness is noise. At macro scales, the law of large numbers converts noise into predictability. Individual quantum events are unpredictable. Individual human choices are unpredictable. But aggregate quantum behavior follows strict probability distributions, and aggregate human behavior does too. Quetelet saw it in 1835. Durkheim confirmed it in 1897. Insurance companies profit from it every day. Your individual actions feel free because you experience them from the inside, but from the outside, from the actuarial tables, from the population statistics, from the probability distributions, your behavior is as predictable as gas pressure, not because you are determined, because you are statistical. Bell died in 1990, months before the Nobel Committee could recognize him. The paper that sat unread in an obscure journal, the theorem that constrained reality forever, he never saw its vindication. Bayes died in 1761. His paper sat with Richard Price for 2 years before publication. The framework that could have prevented wrongful convictions, corrected medical misdiagnosis, exposed financial charlatanism, suppressed for 2 centuries because Ronald Fisher declared it founded upon an error. Sally Clark died in 2007, her life destroyed by statistical illiteracy dressed up as expert testimony. The physicists closed every loophole. The mathematicians built the models. The data accumulated for 3 centuries, and the conclusion is not comfortable. You are watching this video right now. The probability that you would watch it, given your interests, your algorithm, your demographics, your browsing history, was calculable, not with certainty, but within a distribution. You are one of a statistical cohort. Your behavior, in aggregate, was predictable before you made any choice at all. The prison has no walls. That is what makes it perfect. You experience choosing because you are inside the process. You feel the deliberation. You feel the weighing of options. You feel the moment of decision. All of that is real. It is happening. You are not an illusion. But from the outside, from the view of Laplace's demon, from the view of an insurance company's actuarial table, from the view of a social scientist tracking aggregate behavior, you are a data point following a distribution. Both perspectives are true. Neither offers escape. The question Bell forced us to confront in 1964 was never really about particles. It was about you, about whether the fork in the road was ever real or only ever felt real, about whether the experience of deciding is the same as actually deciding, about whether there is any meaningful difference between a choice and a calculation you are always going to make. The math is settled. The experiments are done. The distributions are known. There is a thought experiment philosophers use called the consequence argument. If determinism is true, then our actions are the consequences of the laws of nature and events in the remote past. But it is not up to us what went on before we were born, and neither is it up to us what the laws of nature are. Therefore, the consequences of those things, including our present acts, are not up to us. The argument has a formal, logical structure. It is valid. If you accept the premises, you must accept the conclusion. The only escape is to reject one of the premises, and the premises seem very hard to reject. Peter van Inwagen, who formulated the modern version of this argument in 1983, admitted that he could not find the flaw in it. He believed in free will. He wanted to believe the argument was wrong, but he could not say where it went wrong. Some philosophers appeal to agent causation, the idea that persons can be causes in a way that is not reducible to event causation, that you, as an agent, can originate a causal chain without being caused to do so. But this seems to simply name the mystery rather than explain it. How does agent causation work? What is the mechanism? The question is not answered by giving it a label. Others appeal to quantum indeterminacy. If the brain contains processes sensitive to quantum fluctuations, perhaps there is room for genuine randomness in decision-making. Perhaps the future is not fixed by the past. But as we have seen, this does not help. Randomness is not control. A quantum coin flip deciding your actions is no more free than a classical deterministic process deciding them. Either way, you are not the author. The Monty Hall problem offers a strange metaphor for our predicament. 3 doors, a prize behind one. You choose a door. The host, who knows where the prize is, opens one of the other doors to reveal nothing. Should you switch? The answer, famously, is yes. Switching doubles your probability of winning. But most people refuse to switch. They feel that their initial choice matters, that sticking with their gut is somehow more authentic than updating on new information. Paul Erdős, one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, refused to believe the answer until he watched a computer simulation of 100,000 trials. The man who proved more theorems than anyone in history could not accept a simple probability result until brute empirical force convinced him. Even Erdős, mathematician Andrew Vasseny noted, was convinced only when seeing was believing. Our intuitions are that bad, about probability, about choice, about the nature of the decisions we think we make. Marilyn Vos-Savant, who published the correct Monty Hall answer in Parade magazine in 1990, received an estimated 10,000 letters disagreeing with her. Nearly 1,000 were from PhD holders. Many wrote on university letterhead. One mathematician wrote, "You blew it, and you blew it big." There is enough mathematical illiteracy in this country, and we do not need the world's highest IQ propagating more. Shame, she was right, and the confidence of his wrongness is exactly the problem. We are confident about things we do not understand. We feel certain about questions we cannot answer. We experience choice so vividly that we cannot imagine it as anything other than what it seems. And perhaps that is the deepest prison of all, the prison of certainty about things that are not certain, the prison of feeling free in a universe that may have no room for freedom. You cannot escape a cage you do not know you are in, and now you know.